Okay, welcome everybody. My name's Lee Arts. I'm the director of the Center for Global Studies. It's been 20 months since Russia went into Ukraine, and a lot has transpired since then, including about 500,000 people have died in the battle. We're having a panel today that includes three speakers. I will introduce each of them as we go. But what we are hoping to do is to have different perspectives shared in a dialogue between the speakers and between the speakers and you. So we know that there's been different perspectives on understanding the war in Ukraine and different arguments one way or the other. I've written about the media framing of the Ukraine war. I've published some articles on it. I identified certain sources that were used, the lack of historical context, the focus on the battles, and the ideology supporting NATO and Russia. And I also want to point out that there's other leading scholars, more leading than me actually. Stephen Cohen at Princeton and NYU, John Mersheimer at the University of Chicago, and Larry Williamson at William & Mary. He was a former aide to Colin Powell. They each argued that NATO and the US instigated the crisis by expanding NATO, which Henry Kissinger suggested was not a good idea. They also point to the US funded, they oftentimes call it a coup, in the Ukraine in 2014, where the US contributed $5 billion to the opposition. So, before I introduce the speakers, I want to provide 4 questions. They don't have to speak to these 4 questions. Oh, everybody should turn off their phone, including me. Sorry. None of the speakers have prepared remarks, and I'm not asking them to answer these questions, but these are some of the questions that are remaining for me. One of the first is, did the US and Germany really tell Russia that NATO would not expand 1 inch east? That's a question, that's a factual question. Were there Nazi organizations in Ukraine military and politics? Again, that's a factual question. And some of these I've written about and cited sources that answer the question. Is the Ukraine a democracy? They've banned 11 political parties. They've closed all the independent TV and radio stations. They've been consolidated into one government-controlled outlet. They've banned frontline journalists from reporting in the war in 6 Ukrainian papers and international papers. All print media must publish in Ukrainian, even though 34% of the population speaks Russian. Russian is banned in civil service, education, healthcare, and in cultural events and on statues. That's a question. How democratic is this country that the United States is saying is a beacon for democracy in Europe? The final question is a little bit more touchy, but it's almost, people have said it's like whataboutism. U.S. has aided Ukraine with $118 billion as of last month. Is there a double standard at work? If Russia invasion of Ukraine violates international law, did the U.S. invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan violate international law? Did Israel's current bombing and occupation of Gaza, is that a violation of international law? Is the Saudi bombing of Yemen, which the UN says is the worst humanitarian crisis in the world, is that a violation of international law? So the question is, which violations are worthy of having a response to? So we have 3 well-informed speakers. Again, they may not answer each of these questions. I didn't ask them to. I sprang these on you just now. Indeed you did. And if you don't answer them, we're going to ask each of the speakers to speak about 15 minutes. I will be over here to the side, and I'll give you a little note that says you've got about 2 minutes left, and then after that we turn off the mic. I'm kidding. The first speaker is Dr. Johnathon Swarts. He wrote a book on American foreign policy. He's published many other articles. He's also the dean of the Honors College and University College, and he's going to begin the panel, and then I will introduce the other speakers as they go. Johnathon, thank you.
Well, thank you, and thank you, Professor Arts, for inviting me. It's quite an honor to be invited, and great to see everyone. What a turnout. It's fantastic. I have to say right up front that Eastern European politics, Ukrainian politics is not my specialty. Professor Rupp and I are both political scientists. He's much more of an Eastern European specialist than I am. But I'll try my best as a scholar of international politics to try to take a somewhat different view than perhaps some of the internal questions that Professor Arts asked about that I wouldn't feel qualified to even speak on in some cases. He mentioned something which I think is really important, and I think it does bear discussion as we go through this session today and looking at the picture generally, and that is the question of NATO expansion. And in preparing for this, I did want to talk about NATO and the NATO response and the United States response because I think it's really important. And I think when we look at United States foreign policy, which is kind of my particular interest and what I kind of wanted to talk about, and how we look at this from the American foreign policy point of view, the question of NATO expansion is really important. And Professor Arts mentioned Henry Kissinger, who has basically said in so many words that one of the precipitating factors of this war was the expansion of NATO into Eastern Europe. So I think that's something we really need to keep our eyes on. So I guess I would divide my comments into two different ways of looking at it. The one thing that I would just preface everything by saying is that when you look at American foreign policy, and when you look at the policy of NATO countries, and it's not even NATO countries, it's basically every country around the world, some people would argue. Professor Rupp and I teach about this all the time. Countries are, and groups of countries like NATO, are charged with looking after their own interests, with looking after the interests of their countries and of the countries allied with them. And for those of you that have had political science, you know this is of an approach to international relations called realism. And Henry Kissinger is the ultimate realist, who basically argues that the responsibility of each country is to look after its own defense, to look after its own national security in a competitive world. One of the underlying principles or one of the underlying assumptions of realism is that we live in a competitive world. A dog-eat-dog world, law of the jungle world, eat or be eaten kind of world. And that the only people who can look after your own interests are yourself. It is a self-help system in which if you don't look after your own interests, nobody else will. And so I think that American and foreign policy generally tends to take this perspective, not exclusively by any means. And I think you can see some differences even between the political parties in this country on that score. I think you see the Democratic Party being trying to work in ethical and moral considerations and trying to work in questions of cooperation between countries and trying to achieve greater cooperation. And that's something that probably everyone aspires to at some level. But the realist point of view would say that ultimately the United States, like Russia, like Ukraine, like Israel, like Egypt, like any country you want to pick, has to look after its own national interests. So then that gets to my point. I think there are two issues that we should think about with respect to Ukraine. And that is, there is certainly the question of, did we precipitate this by overreaching? For those of you that don't know, NATO has expanded quite dramatically. I don't know how much of a background you want on this, but NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the security alliance of the United States, formed by the United States and its allies after the Second World War. And essentially, it became a security alliance focused on the Soviet threat, as we perceived it. And it largely consisted of the United States, Canada, and the countries of Western Europe, because countries of Eastern Europe were part of the Soviet bloc of countries during the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. With the fall of communism, 1989, 1990, what happened is that many of those countries in the former Soviet bloc or Eastern bloc became members of NATO. So they became part of our military alliance. And the military alliance that they had been part of, the Warsaw Pact, which was the Soviet Union's military alliance, dissolved. And so what happened was that countries that had formerly been on the western flank of what is now Russia, many of them, bordering Russia in many cases, became part of the United States' security alliance. And if you look at a map, northwest, west, and southwest, by countries allied with the United States. That's what Henry Kissinger was getting at when he said that raised the question, did NATO make a strategic error? Because just as we have interests that we're looking out for, Russia has interests it's looking out for. And being surrounded by the military alliance of another country, largely dominated by the United States, obviously it's 31 countries, but being surrounded by an ostensibly hostile alliance is something that he would argue, and realists would argue, is going to produce a response. We could also consider the internal politics. And Professor Artz kind of mentioned that a little bit. There has been a real repression of the Russian population. The Russian Orthodox Church has been completely repressed, the one that's allied with Moscow. And many of its hierarchs are in jail right now in Ukraine. So the question of whether it's a democracy or not is a very interesting question. But now I would argue we need to switch back to our perspective of realism. Looking at it from the point of view of policymakers in the United States and in Western Europe and in NATO countries generally, and in many other countries allied with us, despite whatever Ukraine may be internally, what is in the national interest of the United States? What is in the national interest of Britain, of France, of Germany? What is in the interest of the world? Is it in our national interest for Russia to be able to invade and potentially occupy a country in Eastern Europe in 2023? And the answer that we as a country in the United States and in most of the Western world have concluded is no. It's not in our interests for this to happen. It's not in the interests of the United States. It's not in the interest of Western countries. And regardless of what Ukraine may or may not be and whatever defects it may have internally, it's not in the interests of peace and democracy around the world for this to be allowed to stand. And ultimately, the example that people will give, and we mentioned this 20 months ago when we had a forum on this, is what many people in the West think about when they think about aggression, they think about invasions, and they think about countries they're opposed to, and that's the example of Munich. Example of Munich in 1938, when the world declined to stand up to Hitler and basically allowed him to take part of Czechoslovakia. And the lesson that the world learned from that, rightly or wrongly, was that if you don't stand up to aggressors, it just invites them to take more. So the message and the motivating factor behind the United States' foreign policy towards Ukraine is this can't be allowed to stand, because if you do, it will simply invite more. Now, we can debate whether or not that's an operative, a valid law of international politics, but it's been widely accepted that if you allow bad actors to do bad things, they'll do more bad things. So what we're seeing then is the United States and the Western European countries essentially trying to do its best to stop this from happening and to reverse it, but not up to the point of actually sending in our own troops. And this is where I think we are today. And if you look at the Biden administration today and the Trump administration before it, we often think there's huge differences between Democrats and Republicans in this country, and Trump is on the totally different end of the spectrum from Biden. But when you look at American foreign policy, there's a lot of convergence there. And I think because realists would say because our interests are the same, regardless of who's in power. And the ultimate, or the overriding consideration that these two administrations have had is to essentially, as I said, to not allow something like this to go unanswered. How can we, and so the question then becomes, or the challenge for us becomes, how can we as a country, how can the NATO countries in the West respond as all of those countries bordering Russia want us to do? Most of those countries are allied with us, and we've seen Finland and Sweden want to join NATO because they're scared to death of what the next step might be. Finland has already joined. Sweden is about to join, if the Turks and Hungarians will agree. What's the fear? The fear, again, is if you allow aggression in one part of the world to stand, it encourages more. You let bad actors take an inch, they'll take a mile. So, what's our foreign policy objective? I think our foreign policy objective basically is to keep the United States out of a shooting war. I don't think there's any domestic appetite for the United States getting directly involved. But I think there's an awful lot of consensus among at least the traditional foreign policy establishment that what needs to happen is the West needs to continue to support Ukraine in its own war. Having Russia bogged down in the Ukraine actually is to our foreign policy advantage. As crass and as cynical as that sounds, if Putin is stuck in Ukraine, he can't cause trouble elsewhere, or he's distracted from causing trouble elsewhere. We have a situation, and this is basically the argument for support to Ukraine. The Ukrainian army has basically got the Russian army bogged down. Perhaps it's a stalemate, we'll have to see, but they've got them bogged down. And they've got them in a situation where basically one of our friends has one of our competitors, or enemies, if you want to use that word, bogged down and degrading their capabilities day by day at a relatively inexpensive cost to us. That's not a bad thing from a foreign policy point of view. That's why the administration, this current administration, the previous administration says we got to keep the aid going. We will go into greater detail as we talk more about this in this discussion today. But I would also point out that as we're seeing, there's a few bumps in the road there. When the invasion happened 20 months ago, there was pretty solid support in the United States and pretty solid support in the West for continuing the fight against Ukraine, giving them as much aid as possible. I think we're seeing that fray around the edges. We saw yesterday the election of a new Speaker of the House that's consistently voted against aid to Ukraine. We're seeing the American public getting tired. They're getting a little war weary with this idea that we could be stuck in a long-term stalemate in Ukraine and paying a lot of money to aid the Ukrainians. We see a certain wing of the Republican Party. We can get more into this if you want, but the Republican Party is basically split between its traditional interventionist wing that kind of gives the view that I've been giving up to this point, and a wing of the party more associated with President Trump, who's basically part of the traditional isolationist wing of the party. So I think and then of course we have the whole situation in Israel and Gaza today, which, if nothing else, is a major distraction from what's going on in Europe, and we can get into that as well. Something that Putin obviously is trying to use to his advantage, the fact that the world's a little bit distracted right now. So I've just gotten the 2-minute hook sign. So that was kind of a very brief and kind of disjointed introduction to what I think are kind of the NATO perspective and the NATO interests involved here. And I'll be happy to kind of have a dialogue with you as we go on further from this point.
Our next speaker is Dr. Richard Rupp, who is the interim chair for the Department of Communications. So he's my immediate supervisor, so I can't say too much. As Dr. Swarts mentioned, Dr. Rupp has long interest in Europe, Eastern Europe. He wrote a book, NATO After 9/11, An Alliance in Continuing Decline. And he's written other articles. He brought some other examples, but and he's going to talk to some of the background of the Ukraine, and you've already got a glimpse of some of the slides that he's shared with Dr. Swarts. So please welcome Dr. Rupp.
Thank you very much. I'm going to dovetail a little bit on what, as far as where we are right now, and is there an end to this? In the spirit of one of your questions, Dr. Arts, about the hypocrisy. Of course there's this hypocrisy. This is politics. And so consequently, when John and I analyze the foreign policies of countries, we're almost intellectual eunuchs. That's just to say we don't have a personal beef in it. Our assessment is that we like to think we can do a similar job of critiquing American foreign policy, Chinese foreign policy, Israeli foreign policy. Of course there's a double standard for the United States to be standing up and outraged that Russia intervened in Ukraine and not to have the same reaction about the invasion of Iraq in 2003. They're very, very similar in the context of wars of aggression. It's also very easy for John and I to, again, take a step back as we analyze foreign policy, because as John mentioned, we assume that nations act in their own selfish interests. And we do that across the board. It doesn't matter for democracies or authoritarian states, they act in their own national interests. That doesn't mean that we don't think they make mistakes in going forward with their national interests. From my perspective as a realist, the mistake of invading Iraq was extraordinarily damaging to the United States and to the Middle East in general. The war in Vietnam, if I were advising the Israeli elite right now, I would say they are making decisions that will ill serve Israel's interests if they're going to continue the scale of bombing and launch a ground war into Gaza. I think they will actually do long-term damage to themselves and the region. So that's how, again, scholars like John and I kind of approach these sorts of issues. So definitely I agree that there's a hypocrisy, but it's an identifiable and accountable hypocrisy. I think the important thing is to be an equal opportunity critic in looking at nations and how they make their decisions, especially for us as educators and not so much as advocates. So I did write a book on NATO, and it basically took up a lot of what we're talking about here today. One of Lee's very thoughtful questions was, did the United States and Germany tell Russia it would not bring, say it one more time, Lee?
Did the U.S. and NATO and Europe tell Russia that they would not expand NATO to
Right.
the east?
Yeah, and also not bring Germany in. So very quickly here, going back to some of these, I'll bring this one in. In 1989, the wall begins to tumble. Eastern Europe breaks free after 45 years of Soviet occupation. And question started to surface about, well, what are we going to do in the future of Europe? What is Europe going to look like after the Soviet Union falls, which it does in 1991? So there were huge conversations around the world about what replaces the Cold War, what replaces this titanic struggle. Never in history have we had two sides armed to the teeth and yet not go to war with each other. They did have proxy wars around the world, which is another topic for us. But the fact that they did not go to war was an extraordinary achievement.
Dr. Rupp?
Yep.
Can I ask you, for purposes of sound
Okay, sure.
and video?
Absolutely.
Sorry, I know.
No, that's fine. Everybody hearing me, I'm sure. My voice carries, but that's okay. So what are you going to do in Europe? Because the Soviet Union has collapsed in 1991, and it didn't collapse because of a military battle with Europe. It largely imploded. That is to say, the internal contradictions of the Soviet state ultimately brought it down, and it didn't hurt that it was overspending radically in its military and foreign policy in this competition with the West. So Gorbachev, singular figure in global politics, plays a central role in bringing the Cold War to a soft ending. So then we have this period of, well, what comes next? What's the post-Cold War period going to be like, particularly for Europe? And the question was, for many of these states, because they had been occupied violently by the Soviet Union for decades, the question was, what direction are we going to head in? There were a lot of scholars in the United States, and actually even President Bush Sr. was saying, we need a Europe united, whole, and free. The idea that we need to bring democracy to the entire continent. Question was, how you do that. That's a very stiff ladder to climb, given the scale of the problems that existed. But there was the general principle and values was how do we bring democracy and peace to this most violent continent on the planet, right?
World War I, 10 million fatalities. World War II, 50 million fatalities. We can't just let it happen. We need organizations. So there were pre-existing organizations in Europe, as far as that many states were members of. One was the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, which most nations were members of. It was a soft alliance, though. It was not a robust alliance, but it was an alliance where many states belonged and had conversations. Then there was the European Union, which was a very robust international organization focused on the economic and political unity of primarily Western Europe. And then there was NATO, which was a military alliance, but I want to stress a defensive military alliance. The Soviet military was designed to wage war deep into Western Europe. The NATO alliance was designed to defend Western Europe, but not have substantial resources to march to Moscow. So it was two different kinds of alliances. So the question was, so what do you do? And the view of the East Europeans, and I did a lot of interviews in Eastern Europe, was that they thought these other organizations were fine. They certainly liked to be members because they wanted to increase their standard of living. Most of them were very committed to wanting to move away from Soviet authoritarianism and some form of democracy. It didn't have to be a capitalist democracy. It could be a socialist democracy, but they wanted to move in that direction. But their real concern, almost more than the first two, was ultimately, like John and I would say, was their ultimate survival, which meant their continuing worry of Russia. So, I'll go back. The Russian Empire, here you go back. The Russian Empire has existed for 400 years, and it has been a very powerful expansionist empire. That map shows you the height of Russian control under the Romanovs from 1613 to 1917, and then the Soviets seized, and they created the same state, and they expanded that state eventually into Eastern Europe. And so, consequently, the East European states were dreadfully concerned that history would repeat itself. So they wanted to be in NATO in order to have that security guarantee. Now, then we have a conversation about, well, should we expand NATO? And there were folks on all sides. And when we say there are realists, and a lot of you haven't taken John and I's class, but it's again a very helpful theory of explaining global politics. But the realists are not all on one side. So that is to say, they look at the same issues, they're the same training, but that doesn't mean they get the same answer. So there were some realists, like Lee was talking about, and they said, no, we have to be careful about, frankly, prodding the bear. If we move NATO to the direct borders of now Russia, they will respond. And then there were other realists, frankly, like me. In the book that I wrote on NATO, I primarily opposed the enlargement because I actually agreed with that crowd that we probably should not increase NATO because I knew, I shouldn't say I knew, but I speculated that if you increase the alliance to a larger number, it's going to be very difficult to have cooperation. It's called a collective action problem. And because NATO was an enormously successful military alliance, even though it never fired a shot. We took NATO, though, from the early 90s to today. I think I've got a map. Where's my map of NATO today? So that's NATO today. And now you have an alliance of over 30 states, and actually they disagree with each other. See, what held NATO together during the Cold War is they had differences, but they all agreed that the Soviet Union was a vital threat to their interest. Now you have quite a few nations of NATO, and they have varying degrees, and they have considerable differences. Turkey, Hungary, Poland, you have considerable differences. So my crowd said, don't expand NATO because what you can do is you can keep the original NATO, but keep it as an insurance policy. Because people like me on that line would say, yeah, as a specialist in this field, well-versed in Russian history, they're down right now. It's 1990, 1995, 2000, but they won't be down forever. And they will look to re-engage that tradition of Russian authoritarianism and Russian imperialism. So that's my perspective of why it was not necessarily wise to engage enlarge NATO. I, however, did not worry about prodding the bear. Because I very much shared the view that Russia was likely at some point to revitalize. And this is where Vladimir Putin gets huge credit, because he did it. The 90s were chaos in Russia. Boris Yeltsin was the leader, really not a stable time. Putin comes to power in 2000, and he spends the first 8 years stabilizing. He's paying pensions, he's using the oil revenue well. But by 2008, it's pretty clear that the Russian bear is anxious to re-engage. It's humiliated. The Soviet Union was humiliated. Putin was humiliated. And so consequently, the idea of having secured the territorial integrity of Greater Russia now was, maybe we want to reconstitute some of what we once had. And so you saw Russia in the Caucasus, in Georgia in 2008, the invasion of Ukraine in 2014, using Russian military in Syria in 2014, 15, 16, and even in Libya. And so the question for me. Thanks. So the question for me is, did we provoke Russia into doing this? I absolutely disagree. I do not think we provoked Russia into this conflict at all. I think that Putin has ambitions. These were pre-existing ambitions. They would have taken place even without the NATO expansion. And he was biding his time. I think, in the spirit of what John was saying about Munich, I think Putin watched American foreign policy during these years, and he said, gosh, the Americans, one, they really screwed up by invading Iraq. They've done a lot of damage to themselves there. They have not responded adequately to Georgia. From our perspective, I shouldn't say ours, but my perspective of Obama's presidency, one of his biggest failings was not to respond to the Soviet Russian seizure of Ukraine. That doesn't mean that Crimea. That doesn't mean that I thought it was we should have responded militarily, but it set the tone that Putin could see that the West wasn't responding. And so that is, in my opinion, one of the primary reasons why Putin thought he could get away with it. And so now we have a cataclysmic war in the region, the biggest since World War II. And perhaps in the questions and answers, we can start to talk about how we end this war, because it hasn't seen we have about 500,000 fatalities at this point, but they're almost in a stalemate right now. In the last year, there has not been substantial movement. And so folks like me, who don't actually like talking about war, but would rather be talking about what is the post-war settlement going to be, it's time to be starting to talk about that, to see how you get Zelensky and Putin to come to some sort of agreement that they can't win militarily, because that's when nations talk to each other. If they still think they can win militarily, they continue to fight. But there's plenty of signs that they cannot. That Russia certainly cannot take all of Ukraine, and that Ukraine cannot take back all that Russia has taken. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you. Our last speaker is Jeff Mackler. Jeff Mackler is administrative coordinator for the United National Anti-War Coalition, and they have a different understanding of the war in Ukraine. He's written widely in many online journals, Counterpunch, the Los Angeles Progressive, Socialist Action. He wrote a book, a short pamphlet recently, Ukraine in Turmoil. So I'd like you to welcome Jeff Mackler.
Thank you, Dr. Arts. I'm a founder of the United National Anti-War Coalition, and it's called UNAC, and we're against all U.S. wars abroad and at home against working people. The United States has 1,100 military bases in 110 countries around the world. China, our new arch enemy, has one military base outside its borders in Djibouti, in the north of Africa, and the Russians have 7. So it's clear that the United States is defending its national interests around the world with troops and military bases. The United States is no angel at intervention. One of our speakers mentioned Vietnam. That war was a mistake, and President Biden says the Iraq war was a mistake, but 4 million people in Vietnam were slaughtered by the United States. I was part of the movement to bring the troops home now. Iraq, another mistake, foreign policy mistake. Millions died. The United States backed the Guatemalan junta. 400,000 indigenous people were slaughtered. The United States backed the Nicaraguan dictatorship under Somoza. 50,000 were slaughtered. The United States backed the Batista dictatorship in Cuba, who killed 50,000 people. The United States embargo, blockade, and sanctions of Venezuela has caused 50,000 people to die of starvation. The United States invaded Iran in 1953, overthrew the government of that country in order to get the oil. And when the head of the Federal Reserve, his name I wrote down, was asked in a 1,000-page book, why the heck did you invade Iran? They had elections. They elected Mossadegh in '53. And he said the 800-pound gorilla in the room was the fact that they had the largest oil reserves in the world. And we couldn't stand by. Now let's talk about Ukraine. My remarks take place in the context of the belief that the United States is an imperialist country. It defends the interests of the super rich. Its national security is the super rich. If you go on Wikipedia or Google to find out what AFRICOM is, African Command, it's the United States military operation in Africa, and it says point blank in bold letters by the U.S. State Department, it says we're there to defend the national security interests of the United States. What national security interest does they have in everyone in every country in Africa? To go back in history for a second, the largest genocide in the history of the world was in the Congo. At the time it was called the Congo Free State. It was personally owned by the King Leopold II. Guess how many people he slaughtered in the colonization of the Congo in the course of all of Africa being colonized? The figure is 12 million people. And those who escaped, he cut off their hands. Adam Hochschild, a professor at UC Berkeley, wrote a book on it, King Leopold's Ghost. King Leopold personally owned the Congo, slaughtered 12,000 people with his army, and got the exclusive rights to rubber and ivory. But guess who got the exclusive rights to minerals? 2 guys. One Rockefeller and the other Morgan, who are now organized in J.P. Morgan Chase, the Chase Manhattan Bank, the merger of the 2 multi-billionaire robber barons of 100 years ago. They still own the Congo, and they still use troops. They overthrew the elected government of Lumumba in the 60s. What about Ukraine? Where did it start? It really started, you could go back to forever, but I'm going to start in about 8 years ago. Ukraine was bankrupt. It had a corrupt leadership that was stealing, which is the same kind of corrupt leadership all over Europe. It couldn't pay its debts to the European Union or to Russia. So a debate began in the European Parliament as to how we're going to get bailed out. The United States said, well, here's our bailout proposal, and the Russians said, here's our bailout proposal. The United States proposal for bailing out was, to be done by the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank and others, and the condition for getting loans for them, for a bankrupt country, was to impose austerity, cut back pensions, ban unions, and other kinds of things. Then we'll give you money. The Russians had a much more generous proposal. They gave more money, less with very few restrictions. So the Ukrainian government, which had a pro-Russian president, gee whiz, I'm having what is the name of that guy, of the president of that country? What? Not Poroshenko, he came second, the first guy. It'll come back to me in a second. Yanukovych said, I'm for the Russian bailout. He was pro-Russian. He had a majority of his party in the parliament, and he wanted to take the Russian offer because it was more generous and less onerous, less austerity-oriented. Demonstrations started in the Maidan Square in Kiev. Tens and hundreds of thousands of people were there to protest the base corruption of the government. But something happened in those demonstrations that shocked the world. The composition changed fundamentally of the protesters. And one day, from the rooftop over Maidan Square in Kiev, it's like central, a bunch of snipers opened fire on the crowd in the Maidan, killing over 100 people. And when they did that, the world press immediately said, you see, this is Yanukovych. We have to get rid of him. The Maidan Square protests had changed. They had changed fundamentally. Speakers then included John McCain, former presidential candidate. And John McCain shared the platform with open fascists. There were two open Nazi parties there, and they took over the Maidan protests, and they were the ones that shot down the people. How do I know that? Because Victoria Nuland, who was a U.S. representative, said so. Her phone calls were interrupted. You can read it online. She said, no, it was not the Yanukovych's people. It was the Nazis from the Svoboda Party or the Right Sector Party. They opened fire. She admitted it. And yet the catastrophe happened. The fascist parties led an assault on the Rada, which is the parliament. And they took it over. And they banned all the majority parties in the country. And they established a government of Nazis, of pro-fascist forms. I have their names. By the way, they had a debate in this new parliament as to who would be the prime minister. And the European Union wanted an ex-boxer, and Victoria Nuland, the U.S. representative, Joseph Biden was the representative of the United States government there. Victoria Nuland said, no, we want Arseniy Yatsenyuk. And the person she was talking to said, yeah, but the European Union, they're paying for a lot of the bailout. They want their man. And her comment was, F-U-C-K, the EU. We're deciding who the prime minister is going to be. So the foreign finance minister of the new Ukraine, the coup Ukraine, the Ukraine that banned all parties who were the government and put tiny fascist types in control, they appointed Natalie Jaresko. She's an American citizen, was not a Ukrainian. They made her the finance minister. They gave Biden's son a $50,000 a month job for the biggest oil corporations in Ukraine. And they appointed one after another of open fascists. My information here comes from the March 5th British online channel 4 News, told the story. The coup leader was Andrei Parubi. He's a member of the Svoboda Party, open fascist party identifying with the Hitlerites. He's a founder of the Social Nationalist Party, which traces its roots to the pro-Nazi Ukrainian movements of World War II. The British television station's account of the coup government was, overseeing the armed forces alongside Parubi as the Deputy Secretary of National Security is Dmitry Yarush, the leader of the right sector, a group of hardline nationalist street fighters who previously boasted that they were ready for armed struggle to free Ukraine. Other Svoboda neo-Nazi leaders instantly elected to the top echelons of the new Ukrainian government were the Deputy Prime Minister, Oleksandr Sich, the Ecology Minister, Andrei Markak, I can't pronounce the Russian name, the Agricultural Minister, Igor Shavika, and the Acting Prosecutor General, whose name was Oleg Machinsky. And the list goes on. In other words, the United States government backed a fascist coup that stormed the Rada, that was initiated by Nazi snipers from the rooftops that murdered people. And what did they do, this new coup government that banned everybody, banned the elected government from even entering the Rada? And the United States backed them from day one. First thing they did was they banned the Russian language. And the second thing they did is they ordered the Ukrainian troops to march on the east, where 30% of the population is Russian speaking, and to wipe them out. And why? Because they opposed the coup. In Odessa, people demonstrated against the coup, and the Nazis murdered them. They were forced in a trade union building. They set it aflame. They had to jump out in flames, and they were beaten to death when they got on the ground. The United States backed that. So what we're talking, so they marched on the east to wipe out the resistors, that is, the people who supported the elected government in the country and not the US-backed coup government. And they met with resistance. So they ordered the Ukrainian army in the east and Crimea to attack the Russians. Well, the Ukrainian army disintegrated overnight. And they all joined with the Russians to defend them because they didn't feel like shooting down their own people, Russian-speaking. And the Crimean army, which is 90%, 95% Russian-speaking, did the same. They all joined the Russian army. So what is this all about? During the 8 years, the interim, the Ukrainian government attacked the Russian-speaking people and murdered 14,000 of them, according to United Nations, because they were Russian-speaking and they opposed the coup. I'm against that. Meanwhile, the United States had a military base on the border of Ukraine, and it trained 35,000 people, and later, as soon as the next year, 2015, it brought in its fighters from 28 different countries, including the major capitalist countries and all over the world, the same people it brought in to do its bidding in Syria. They were preparing for an invasion. I was driving my car around Oakland, Berkeley, where I live in California, and I kept listening to this radio broadcast saying, President Biden says the Russians are going to invade. We have intelligence that the Russians are going to invade. That's February, last year. And every day, the same news. The Russians, and then the Russian invaded. What they didn't say is that the United States built NATO and had 280,000 troops poised to invade and take over the Russian-speaking language, or the Russian-speaking population. During the interim years, the Russian government met regularly with the Ukrainian government, overseen in negotiations, overseen at Minsk, and signed protocols to solve the problem. In today's New York Times, yesterday's, the ex-foreign minister of Germany said, I was part of this. We reached agreement on how to end the war in Ukraine. Angela Merkel, the German president, said the only reason we didn't sign the Minsk, the United States wouldn't let us sign the Minsk Accords, is because the United States said, no, we want the war. Now, why the heck? So in other words, there was a negotiated settlement which said that Ukraine would be made whole, and they settled on all the resources and everything else, and they set up a regional federation. Can I take one more minute? Okay, so why did this all happen? It happened because the United States had a multi-trillion-dollar gambit that they wanted to pull off. Russia was the #1 supplier of all of Western Europe, 50–60% of its fuel, cheap fuel. The United States in 2014 became for the first time a net export of fossil fuel. They fracked the heck out of the environment, and they produced liquid natural gas at twice the price, and they plan to send that natural gas from Ukraine to Germany. Germany was half owner of the pipeline. That is to substitute American corporate oil, Shell, ExxonMobil, and so on, for Russian oil. That was the gambit. And Seymour Hersh, a former Pulitzer Prize winner from the New York Times, wrote an article explaining how the United States blew up the Nord Stream pipeline that the Russians used for decades to supply natural gas. Now the United States is worried about Niger in Africa, because the United States is building, through its ally and resource-rich Nigeria on the east coast of Africa, through Niger to Europe, pipelines to pipe in American gas so they can substitute. So yes, it's in the national security interests of the United States, but not the people. Not the people of this country. It's in the interest of the oil company, the oil corporations. They run the country. Thank you so much for inviting me, and I appreciate your other speakers.
Well, as I suggested, there is differences of opinion on Russia's entrance into Ukraine. And now would be a good time for you, if you have questions or comments to any of the speakers. Yes.
So my question to all the speakers is, the United States and most, if not all, countries in Western and Central Europe have imposed sanctions across Russia, and across specific people in Russia, but also that affect all the citizens. Why are sanctions not considered to be an act of war when their purpose is to destabilize the economy and hopefully destabilize the country itself? We use sanctions across the world, but we largely consider them not to be acts of war, even though their purpose is to, destabilize.
Lee, I'm a little deaf. Could you roughly repeat?
Yeah, the question was, why are sanctions not considered an act of war, essentially?
Exactly, yeah.
Yep. Sanctions where? Sanctions anywhere. The question was, are sanctions anywhere an act of war because it affects the general population? So.
Pardon my old man appearance. The United States has instituted sanctions against 44 countries around the world. And they say these sanctions are there to defend the national security interests of the United States. That's why they have troops everywhere. And when some country doesn't do what they want, they get overthrown, invaded, embargoed, or sanctioned. So the United States sanctions one country after another because they don't agree to the terms of an oil exchange, or because they don't like the way they voted in the United Nations. The United States sanctioned Nicaragua. There, the Nicaraguan people made a revolution in 1979, and the United States financed an opposition that killed tens of thousands of people. They don't like the idea that the Nicaraguan government is not friendly to the United States. The United States sanctions Cuba, that made a revolution to overthrow the US-backed dictators in 1959. They didn't like the idea that the Cubans gave the land to the people, that they nationalized the wealth of the country and built a healthy state with the highest medical qualities and life longevity in all of Latin America. They sanctioned Iran, and they are sanctioning it today. And they're sanctioning Venezuela. These two countries just happen to be the largest fossil fuel reserve holders in the world. They want that oil. They stole all of Venezuelan Citgo assets in banks across the country because they didn't like the government. They don't like any government that doesn't defend the interests of the United States. The United States just 2 years ago organized and supported a coup in Bolivia, because the Bolivian government had the nerve to nationalize the lithium industry, that the United States wanted lithium for car batteries. It's the same thing everywhere. National security is defined by the interests of the corporate elite. And war and sanctions and blockades take a terrible toll on the people. As I said, some 60,000 Venezuelans have died of starvation because the United States sends the military off the coast and doesn't allow them food. And now they're doing the same thing to the Palestinians. 5,000 of them died in a week, more probably. I think the latest figure is 5,600. And they're starving the place to death, and it's been starved before. It's the largest open-air prison in the world with the highest population density. And they're condemning the Palestinians for invading the darn land that they were born in. That's what Palestine means to them. When I was a kid, Palestine was one country, and the Zionist population was like 6%. Now it's totally different.
With respect to the question about sanctions, I mean, I think that you could look at it as an aggressive act, but I think in most cases sanctions are actually used as an alternative to aggressive military action. I think you can question oftentimes their effectiveness. I think the recent record has shown that sanctions oftentimes aren't very effective. Jeff mentioned the blockade against Cuba that's been going on for 60 years. That obviously didn't bring about its intended goal, which was the overthrow of the communist government there. But I think that's ultimately the motivation behind sanctions, is to try to influence other governments' actions short of active force. In the case of Russia, I mean, I think the other way to think of it is, rather than seeing it as, an aggressive act, I mean, there's no human rights requirement, or there's no, divine mandate that we trade with every country in the world. And if you don't like what another country's doing, you have the right not to trade with that country. And you have the right to get your friends not to want to trade with that country. I mean, I think the thing that's we don't want to lose sight of in the case of Ukraine, and this is where I definitely would differ with Jeff on this point, is if we see everything that's happening in Eastern Europe and Ukraine, in fact around the world, as solely being the result of American actions or American interests, and I even frame my own comments from that perspective. I think we overlook the fact that in the case of Ukraine, it's not just the United States that has this view of Russia and of Putin. It's basically everybody else in Europe, and lots of other people around the world as well. When we look at that map, and we look at the Finns and the Swedes desperately wanting to join NATO, if NATO is such an aggressive, human rights violating, terrible alliance that's bent on spreading destructive capitalism around the world, that's a detriment to everyone's interests except that of the United States, then why are countries knocking at the door trying to get in? I think the fact that they want to get in is a reflection of the fact that the alternative, which is posed by Putin's vision of what society looks like, compared to the vision of society that the Swedes and the Finns have enjoyed as free democratic countries over the last 80 years, since the Second World War, I think the choice is obvious, and that's why I think you want to see countries wanting to join NATO. I mean, I think at some point we have to, we can leave the realism side. Having said everything that Professor Rupp and I said about realism, you can see how people vote with their feet. And it's not as if the Finns and the Swedes and the Norwegians and all the other countries of Western Europe are somehow subservient to the United States. These are countries that have very different social policies than we do. These are countries that have large social welfare states that basically don't take our view on lots of issues like gun control or abortion or capital punishment. They're very different in many respects from us. But we all do share the same fundamental core values, and that core values must be awfully attractive to people because, as Professor Rupp said, as soon as the Soviet Union fell, countries were knocking the door to get into NATO. I know this may preempt another question, so maybe I'll hold off onto it. I'll ask you to ask the question, and that is, should Ukraine join NATO? Or should we want Ukraine to join NATO? Because I think that's a key question going forward.
Before we go too far, I want to announce to you that the Center for Global Studies has another forum next Wednesday on the war in Palestine. Toka Hassan from our department and Benjamin Balthazar from Indiana University South Bend. Please take one and pass them down and pass them around. I'm the moderator, so I know I should limit my comments, but I just want to point out that it's true that most of Europe is in favor of the Ukraine war, but it's also factually true that the majority of African countries, Latin American countries, and Asian countries are not in favor of the war and did not vote to sanction Russia. In fact, when Zelensky had a forum for Africans, 4 people came. Out of, 40 or 50 nations, only 4 came, which gives you an idea of people voting with their feet is not just with, in Europe. Yes.
Yeah, so, and this is an open question to everybody up there as well. So, I literally wrote this down right before you had set it up there, but if the war ends and Ukraine, I believe they were promised some kind of an expedited entrance into NATO after the end of the war. If something like that happens, what does that look like for the interior of Ukraine, and how does that restructure their government and some of the mentioned corruption that lays within it? Sure.
So I mentioned that one of the questions that could be is along these lines: how does this war come to an end? Because wars come to an end. Very few wars are ongoing, and so to in part answer your question, there's speculation going forward right now about how recognizing that we are I shouldn't say unfortunately, we're at something of a stalemate. Neither side is seemingly going to prevail. If you don't begin negotiations, if you don't begin talks, it's just going to continue and continue and continue. The book I wrote on NATO was published in 2006, and at that time I was calling for the United States to pull out of Afghanistan because I said, eventually we are going to pull out and it will be the status quo of 2006. Well, we pulled out in 2020. So consequently, rather than wait, the conversation should take place now. Some of the most interesting writing, I think I'm going to put up a map of Ukraine if I can. Some of the most interesting writing takes us into history, which is how did the Korean War between North and South Korea and then its proxies, or the proxies were North and South Korea, I suppose, and the United States and the Soviet Union, China, how did that come to an end? Because by 1953, you also had a situation, but really 1952, that neither side was prevailing. And neither side was going to escalate, even though they had the bomb on both sides, if you will. And so the two sides entered into very substantial negotiations, and they ended up with what is called an armistice. An armistice is not a peace agreement. It is a settlement of hostilities. And so that is probably one of the best bets for diplomats and Ukrainians and Russians to be thinking about. A cessation of the hostilities. It will be very unsatisfactory to both because if I may, I'll keep my voice up. The demarcation
armistice will probably be giving Russia the territory that is seized in the last 2 years, or going back to the Crimea in 2014, and there will be a border established. And if you can get the two sides to agree to that, the border would then conceivably be demilitarized, but I don't suspect that will be the case. I expect it will be a highly militarized border by the Ukrainians and the Russians. But it is putting a pin in it for future conversations. To answer your question, I think one of the issues in those discussions will be the Ukrainians, Zelensky will say, I don't want to do this, but if you make me, I want NATO membership. And the Russians may say, well, there will be no armistice if you have NATO memberships. So those will be the conversations going forward. And as John says, it's getting very tricky because there is a slackening of support. There's a certain level of exhaustion, especially as we're watching this current conflict in the Middle East. Will Europe and the United States maintain its robust and very expensive support for the Ukrainians? There's no question that Putin seems to think that he can wait them out. And so the question will be, will they be able to bring their negotiators, their politicians, to some degree of an understanding that neither of us can prevail. So for now, let's have an armistice. That's how I certainly, and that's, as a policy analyst, that's what I would advise at this point. And I'm pretty sure that's the advice that Zelensky is getting from the White House. Can I get this over to you? Nope. Okay, sorry. Actually, why don't John, you can move over here and he can just going forward, we can just do it like that. How's that?
Oh, thanks. Well, what the United States doesn't want to negotiate is its right to be the major, if not sole supplier of fossil fuel to Europe. That's what the war was really about. There are some minor things. The United States, Russia does not want a NATO power with nuclear weapons 5 minutes from Moscow on its border. They have a bit of sensitivity. They lost 27 million people in World War II to the fascist invasion. 90% of Hitler's troops were on the Russian front. So they're a little sensitive about that. And when they talk about denazification, they have, and I got my data from the New York Times, the British press, they have a whole host of Nazis, including Nazi brigades with fascist symbols that slaughter innocent Russian-speaking people in the East. I support the right of the Russian-speaking people to self-determination. Within weeks, 700,000 of them, of the bombing by NATO in Ukraine, by Ukraine government, fled to Russia. And Putin's poll figures went up to 86% because they're all related to each other. There are Russians living in Ukraine, Ukrainians living in Russia, and they have families, kids together. So the war was very popular. Everybody expected it to end quickly, but it didn't. The United States calculated that if they organized a blitz war with 280,000 troops totally armed by NATO, they could wipe out the independent republic that the republics in Donetsk and Luhansk declared in a matter of days. The Russians calculated that they're not going to wait. They invaded, and they figured they would wipe out Ukraine's army quickly. Limited bombing. Both sides miscalculated, and now you have a war that's going to be fought until the last Ukrainian is dead. That's a terrible tragedy. Hundreds of thousands of people, 8.1 million are dispossessed from their homes. The infrastructure of the country is destroyed. But this is very profitable for the national security interests of the United States. We have a $1.1 trillion military budget, greater than the next 10 nations combined, and war is profitable. Sending the tanks and the jet planes, not to mention the fossil fuel and the advisors, is profitable for a capitalist system. So they don't mind if this goes on. Now on the people. The latest polls show that a majority of the American people are against further funding for Ukraine. One of our previous speakers mentioned that, Congress can't pass a resolution. But the American people are war weary, and they know the truth about the history of U.S. intervention and sanctions around the world. The governments of NATO are like the United States, pro-capitalist corporate governments. But the people of those countries are not for war. The people, like the American people, don't want to send their kids to go and die in another war for profit. So the Ukraine war is a terrible tragedy, and it takes place in the context of both powers having nuclear weapons. Just imagine if one country, and Russia has thousands, drops a nuclear weapon on the other. That could pose the future existence of civilization. That's what we're looking at. So our view in United National Anti-War Coalition is U.S. hands off. No more funds for Ukraine. Self-determination for the right of the Russian-speaking people to live as opposed to being to wipe out. And we give no credibility to the Ukrainian coup government. 2 points real quick. The United States announced that it was sending blockbuster bombs to Ukraine. How many of you heard of that? That's the worst weapon you can imagine. It breaks into tiny fragments and kills thousands of people, and the unexploded portions stay wherever they're dropped and can be stepped on. And it's banned in almost every single country in the world except the United States. And the United States continues to manufacture them and sends them to Ukraine. That's an inhuman weapon. So war is profitable for the war profiteers. What's his name, who was the head of ExxonMobil, Rex Tillerson, called Trump privately in a national security meeting a moron because Trump said he wanted to increase 100-fold the amount of nuclear weapons that the United States has, tactical nuclear weapons, by 100 times what we have now. What kind of insanity can you have with a person who's the head of state who wants to manufacture countless number of, quote, tactical, they just take out a city, not like, a mini A-bomb. So we're an anti-war coalition. Bring the troops home now. Self-determination for the poor and oppressed around the world. Money for human needs, not war. That's where we stand.
I would thank you all for coming. I want to thank the three speakers for coming and sharing their point of view. I would just leave with one question for you to think about as you plan to come to the event next week, and for our speakers to think about. What is the national interest of any nation? To what extent does a national interest can include the people that live there as opposed to representatives? That's a question I asked you to think about. There may be no clear answer to that, but thank you again for coming. I hope to see you next Wednesday at 5 o'clock in Powers 130.